What's next for Huawei as Google restricts access to its technology? How will consumers in the industry be affected? And could this change the course of the ongoing US-China trade war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Major technology companies are considering their next steps after the US president blacklisted Huawei. The Chinese firm is accused of endangering US national security. American suppliers have 3 months to keep supporting Huawei users before they have to cut ties. Google says it'll carry on updating its software on existing Huawei devices, but new handsets won't have access to Google's operating system and applications. That's raising questions about how the world's second largest mobile phone maker will adapt. Huawei's founder says the US is underestimating his company's abilities.
Although this time we're on that blacklist, our own company won't be affected by it. But the US is a country with the rule of law. US companies cannot avoid respecting the law. As the media reports on this, they should deeply understand that US companies share a common fate with us.
Well, let's have a look at how we got here. Last week, the US President Donald Trump added Huawei to a trade blacklist. That means the telecom giant can't get technology from US firms without government approval. Washington says Huawei acts for the Chinese government and might have been spying on Americans. Huawei denies that, though. The US is urging its allies to ban Huawei products in 5G mobile networks, and some countries have stopped using the firm's equipment. All of this is seen by many as another escalation in the US-China trade war. Let's bring our guests into the show. We have joining us in Washington, D.C., Robert Scott, Senior International Economist at the Economic Policy Institute. On Skype from Hong Kong, Pauline Loong, a veteran China policy risk analyst. She runs the research consultancy Asia-Analytica. And in Preston in the UK, Max Iser, lecturer in computer and network security at the University of Central Lancashire. He specialises in security and consumer trust in new technologies. Good to have you all with us. If I could start with Robert, though. This isn't the end, is it, what happened with Google? We're about to see even more companies follow suit and end business with Huawei, right?
Exactly. I think this is we're coming here at a critical moment as the 5G networking systems begin to be rolled out in the United States and other countries, and there's growing concern that Huawei's technology represents a real threat to security for the U.S. companies and the U.S. government if its equipment is used in these systems. The company was hit with, I think, 23 indictments earlier this year for theft of intellectual property and for fraud. The CIA has determined that Huawei is getting funding from Chinese security agencies, and the company Vodafone has found backdoors in some of its technology that will allow Chinese sources to get access, hidden access to information used in these systems.
All right, given everything Robert has said, let me take this question to Pauline. The Commerce Department's order means that US companies which want to sell to Huawei need to get a license. In practical terms, given everything Robert's just outlined there and the allegations against it, how easy would it be for US firms to sell to Huawei at this point? I mean, to get a license to sell?
Well, it would depend on how easy Washington wants to make it, whether the Huawei thing is a negotiating ploy in the trade discussions, or whether it is, and I believe it is, a change, as in the first step towards a widening of the dispute between the two countries. It's not just about trade
Pauline,
anymore.
it sounds like you feel that this is highly politicized. This is not just about a straightforward security matter.
But security is everything for a country. If you believe that a company, whether it's a commercial company, whether it's a government-run company, is and can do your nation harm, then it becomes a different story altogether. I don't believe it's a matter of commercial competition, that Huawei is a commercial competitor. I do believe that Washington thinks that Huawei is more than just a commercial competitor. It's a security risk.
Well, this is obviously a very serious development for Huawei, isn't it, Max? How will it impact the company when eventually, I think after this 3-month period, it looks like no US firms are going to be able to sell or supply any technology or components to it?
Well, it's really interesting these times when a big company like Huawei is coming under this kind of pressure. Customers on one side are raising a lot of questions and concerns. I mean, in the last 2 days, since today, a lot of people start asking these questions. Can we still use this phone? Can we actually trust to use this phone? Can I open my online banking? Should I actually go and buy a new phone? So in the short term, there's a lot of concerns, a lot of trust issues emerging, especially on the security side of mobile phones and technologies from the customers, whether we're talking about current customers or future customers. So it is a really tricky situation for Huawei at the moment.
It's obviously an issue in consumer trust, but coming back to Huawei's options right now, I wonder, Robert, can Huawei quickly find alternatives to those US suppliers?
Well, for example, take the Google question. I know that Huawei has announced that what they get from Google in part is the Android operating system that it uses to run many of its phones. Huawei has announced that they're in the process of developing their own backup operating system for those phones. So I suspect that they can probably, given the fact that they have access to massive state resources in China, they can probably innovate their way around this problem and survive. The question is whether or not if their major markets will be cut off in the United States and especially in Western Europe. I think Huawei will probably continue to be able to sell phones in China and elsewhere, perhaps in many countries in Asia, but I think this is going to cut its growth going forward.
That is an interesting question. Before we get into it, though, I want to come back to Max and say, even if they find a workaround, if they can innovate their way around this one, there is going to be some impact on Huawei users. Will any sort of innovation be able to get around the trust issues and to get around perhaps the loss of, for new customers, the loss of anything related to your Google apps, basically?
Well, Huawei were saying that they were preparing for this eventuality. They called it Plan B, which means that they were thinking about it. They were developing their own operating systems. They have a history because in China, they don't have access to Google services anyway, and they have like a middle track, so they can actually pull the security update and any new things from Google on Android and push it to their customers in China.
That may be true,
they have
Max,
to do
but I
this
imagine for users in the US and perhaps other parts of Western Europe who are used to having access to their usual apps, saying, well, we can open up an alternative Chinese app store for you, might not really meet people's expectations and needs, right?
That's true, indeed. You're absolutely right, because a lot of people like the feasibility and the usability of Android phones because they have Google Maps installed, they have Google Assistant, everything is ready and done for you. Now, to get used to a new system is going to be very challenging for Huawei to gain customers' satisfaction and customers' trust. I mean, we see people a little bit reluctant to move from an Apple phone to an Android phone because they don't want to experience this change. They want everything to run as smooth as possible. So it's very challenging to see how people will react to a new app store, new technology, new operating system. It's not an easy road for Huawei in the future.
It's definitely not an easy road. Pauline, do you agree with Max's point there? I think where we're heading is that effectively Huawei is going to be locked out of the US market, not only because consumers in the US and perhaps Western Europe are going to be, not very happy with losing their access to the App Store, but also because the US, let's not forget, has got another ban about banning its companies from even installing Huawei networking equipment. When you put all that together, is Huawei basically out of the US market?
Well, if Washington continues with its policy the way it's been towards China, yes, I think Huawei is essentially out of the US market, not just the US market, but many European markets. I mean, it is true, people don't want to change. You have an iPhone, you don't want to go to an Android, you have an Android, you don't want to go to an iPhone, and you certainly don't want to switch over to a Huawei system. People buy Huawei phones, I believe, because of the price, not because they like its operating system, because it doesn't have one. It takes Western technology.
Do you think the US will continue with this approach, or is this just perhaps a tactical maneuver in trade negotiations? What do you think, Robert?
Well, I think we really have crossed a watershed in the development of our relationship with China. I think there's a growing interest, not just in the U.S. government, but amongst many U.S. companies in stepping back from engagement with China. There's a recognition that the way its government interacts with and supports companies like Huawei represents a growing threat to the United States, not only on a technological basis. For example, we've talked mostly here about phones, but I think the bigger question is the use of Huawei networking equipment in the development of 5G networks in the U.S. and around the world. I think that's really a major threat. So I think there is a growing recognition that we really need to step back and disengage and reduce our reliance on these Chinese companies. And this is true not just for Huawei. We saw it last year in the debate with the Chinese phone company ZTE. There's currently a big debate in the U.S. about involvement with a Chinese rail car company, which has provided rail cars to Los Angeles and Chicago and Philadelphia. And this concerns that the use of these rail cars represents a security threat to consumers who were riding in them with their phones. So I think there's really a growing recognition that there's a systemic problem here that we need to step back from.
Max, no doubt some of Huawei's rivals are going to have a field day with this. Is this going to reshape the market, and who stands to gain?
Well, we want to see how things will develop because at the moment, like you've just mentioned earlier, there's a 90 days temporary supply that will continue, but I think the decision Google has taken, even if it's withdrawn later, during negotiation or anything like this, I think Huawei got the message that they need to develop their own system, they need to develop their own apps, and like I said before, it is going to be a challenging task for them in the short and the midterm future for their users.
Pauline, what do you make of the suggestion that as fierce as the bans and restrictions look now, the US might just lift them all on Huawei, just as it did before on ZTE?
They did not lift everything. What they did was to put in a lot of conditions for its operation. I mean, for instance, they've even got an American on the board to make sure that, they're watching everything that's being done. They changed the entire management. So what the newspaper headlines have been focusing on is, ZTE got a reprieve. Well, actually, it's a little bit less than that.
Do you see that sort of scenario potentially playing out here, Pauline? That perhaps some conditions are put in place and Huawei's welcome back into the American market?
At this point, I can't really see it. I mean, basically, the question of Huawei isn't, I mean, are there, are they spying? Can we prove that they're spying? The question is, do they have the means, motive, and opportunity? If your country and China are at loggerheads, will Huawei have the means, motive, and opportunity to do you harm? And I think the answer in Washington, in the present climate, is a big yes.
Talking about Washington, let's go back then to Robert and say, let's not forget, some of these bans and restrictions are obviously going to hurt American companies, right? They're going to see some of their sales drop. I think we already saw the share price of some of these companies on Monday, like Broadcom and Qualcomm, drop. There's going to be some suffering on the US side, right?
There's no question. And I think that's the other side of the politics here, that the suppliers may push back against these restrictions. I think that's part of the reason why ZTE was eventually let off the hook and was allowed to settle the complaints in that case. But the two cases are really fundamentally different. In the earlier case with the ZTE, the major complaint there was fraud, and that they had violated U.S. restrictions on trade with North Korea and Iran. And they were able to put in place controls within the company to make sure that problem was not repeated. Here, we're talking about fundamental security threats, as we've been discussing, in terms of creating backdoors that would expose the U.S. to harm as a result of China's security system having access to secrets from both the government and the private sector. So it's a trade-off. Yes, in the short run, we're going to lose sales to Huawei, but in the long run, there are going to be replacements for that equipment that are going to be developed here and in other countries. So new markets will develop. So I think it's a transitional problem for U.S. suppliers.
Max, from a perhaps security perspective, how unique are the, shall we say, national security concerns to Huawei compared to any of its competitors or alternative systems?
I think the main concern from a national security point of view is the technical ability for Huawei to install backdoors or have ways to access information, or there's also a growing concern that if Huawei wants to install like a kill switch to shut down the network, that could be possible. From a technical point of view, it is possible. Now, whether Huawei will do that's a completely different issue.
But do we know, Max, if any other alternative systems or platforms have the exact same features, or backdoors, kill switches? I mean, how much do we really know about what's going on, not only with Huawei, but with the competition?
Well, it goes back to a trust issue. I think the main issue with Huawei is their links probably to the Chinese state with other companies, because they regard themselves as private companies. They don't have governmental links, so they are more trusted. They come across more reliable in the market, and because they are more about competition, more about providing a good service to their customers, and they operate on an international level. As I said before, they are trusted, they've been tested before. So that's why there is more tendency to trust these providers in comparison to Huawei lately.
Mm-hmm. Pauline, how much concern do you think there is in... All right, I'll give Robert a chance. Go in. You wanted to get in on this one. Go ahead, Robert.
I just wanted to stress the broader point. I think the difference between Chinese companies like Huawei and, say, a company like Apple in the United States, which has had its own security problems, is that in China you have the role of the state, as we've been discussing. You've got a big problem with state-owned enterprises, and beyond that you have the involvement of the Chinese army and other Chinese military services directly and indirectly in these companies. Sometimes it's in a public way, more often it's not. And I think that's really where the core security concern lies, is that there is a different way of operating in China.
Right. Pauline, how much concern is there in China or perception that this is really part of a trade war? If it's not resolved, well, maybe other Chinese companies might be targeted, Lenovo, Oppo, and so on and so forth.
Oh, I think there is a great deal of concern that this is just the start of a list of companies that might be put on the blacklist. So that's why President Xi Jinping has been making visits earlier this week to rare earth factories and places like that to say, hey, we do have retaliatory options. So yes, China is very concerned.
What kind of retaliatory options does China have at this point?
Well, it seems to be basically two that are cost effective. One is, as I said, rare earths, because China has effectively cornered the market on rare earths. And the other one that people don't seem to think about is the market of 1.4 billion people. And with that sort of a market, you get capitalists and companies really wanting to have a bite of that. So you dangle a bit of carrot, and you hope that there will be a lot of companies lobbying Washington on your behalf.
Robert, 2020 elections, not too far away. How far do you think the US president wants to see, I guess you could say, US companies and consumers suffering?
Well, I think that's really the big question. You know, in terms of the Chinese market, it's still for U.S. producers, for production in the United States, is relatively unimportant. We export about $100 billion a year to China worth of goods. Most of it's raw materials that they need to make things for export back to us. We import about $500 billion worth. So it's a 5-to-1 ratio there. China as a market is more important to companies like GM that's selling cars there, making profits there, cars that they make in China. But in terms of the production from the U.S., it really doesn't register very much. The question is, what is Trump going to do about this? Is he going to cut a deal? Are all these threats really just designed to generate some kind of press release that he can announce? Or does he think that for his 2020 campaign, he's going to be better served by having an active, in the economic sense, a shooting war, by having tariffs across the board in place? Is that going to be a symbol to his voters that he's really doing something about our trade problems? I for one, think the bigger question is, has he actually achieved anything with these policies? Yes, it's a good idea to address the security concern, but has he addressed fundamental concerns such as the overvaluation of the U.S. dollar, which he promised to do? He's done nothing about that to date.
I guess time will tell. It's been fascinating, and it's been fascinating discussing this with you. So let's thank all of our guests at this point for this discussion: Robert Scott, Pauline Loong, and Max Iser. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website. Aljazeera.com is the address. And of course, for further discussion, just head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here at Inside Story. For now, thanks for watching. Goodbye.